everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are gonna tie some knots in our yarn to dye it. Now, the goal of adding just a knot, I'll show you how I did this in a moment, into our yarn is to add resist. So when we go and dye something like this, the dye is going to access the exterior of this, but all the yarn in the interior of this knot is going to get less dye, and therefore we can open up the yarn, re-knot it, shift it, play, and see what kind of colors we end up with. And here, let me just untie this knot quickly and not tangle the yarn. Before I tie myself into knots, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partners, Lainey Mueller and Christopher Mikesell. Lainey and Christopher, thank you so much for being my lab partners for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I almost feel like I should have asked Keith from ChemKnits to make an appearance today, but we are just going to be doing a simple, I don't know what kind of knot this is, overhand knot. And we could keep it really loose like this. The looser the knot is, the more dye can enter the interior, or we can tighten it up a bit more like that. Now, in theory, I don't think these skeins, this is Knit Pick Stroll, by the way. We could potentially knot it like a second time. I don't think that's what I want to do today. I think today I want to focus on a single knot, but depending on how we like the results, we can always knot the yarn more. Our yarn today is Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. If you want to learn more about the yarn base, I have links and affiliate links down in my video description, and I may earn a commission if you make a purchase through one of those links. Now, doing this kind of knotting, there is a potential that we could tangle our yarn. So I'll be adding additional zip ties onto all of our skeins. These removable nylon zip ties can help me in the end figure out the order and the direction that the yarn needs to go. If things feel tangled, we can always wait till the end to fix it. But again, I haven't decided yet how many layers we're gonna dye this yarn. Stroll soaks up dye pretty quickly, so that is worth considering. Now, like any other type of resist dyeing, I think I'm going to start loose and then we'll tighten once I have all three, because I want to try to be consistent here. This type of resist is probably the most similar to me doing something like dyeing twisted skeins, where again, there we use the yarn as its own resist. There are also potentially some similarities to dyeing wound balls of yarn and yarn cakes, not in the sense that we'll end up with a gradient of any kind here, but more in the sense that we have a dense ball here, and we know that with this particular yarn and acid, the colors aren't likely to go in very far. Even with things really loose, but I am gonna tighten it a little bit, especially because for this first round of dyeing, which depending on what we end up with could be the only round, or we could do multiple, we'll see how things go. But the first round of dyeing, I'm planning on starting with the yarn dry. Just like any yarn dyeing technique, there are pros and cons to dyeing yarn dry versus dyeing yarn wet. If you are gonna dye your yarn dry, the biggest caveat, most of the time I advocate that you pre-soak your yarn, because if you want, it's not just about even coverage. Some yarns aren't as absorbent as others, and so without a pre-soak, you could end up with dry patches that then don't absorb color at all, and then that can be frustrating in the end. It all depends on the technique you're going for. Now, I know that Stroll is extremely absorbent. It absorbs water really, really quickly, and so starting dry is never really a problem with this yarn base, unless you're going for extremely even coverage, which we tied a knot in the yarn. We're not going for even coverage here. The bigger question, which I'm not going to be answering today, is will starting dry give us more color in the center of the yarn knot or less? And honestly, I don't know. So our yarn is like a sponge, and when we add the dry yarn into the dye bath, it's gonna soak up the dye. But the dye can also start sticking to the first yarn it comes into contact with. So even though we're gonna suck liquid into the center of like our little knot here, that doesn't mean that dye will make it all the way to the center, because it might bind, or it very much likely will bind, to the areas around it. Now, if we started with a very wet knot and added it into the pot, it would be like adding a full sponge into the pot. Dye would eventually make its way in, but it wouldn't be soaking up liquid in the same way a dry one would. So that water could be a little bit of a resist. But the liquids may move into dry yarn a little bit slower than they would into damp yarn that isn't holding a lot of water. So this variable of how wet your yarn is before you dye it is one that is extremely hard to control for. You can do dry, you can do pre-soaked, but the amount of water that you still have in your yarn when you start dyeing it, I suppose you could weigh it. That's probably the only way I can think of to control that amount of water that you have in your yarn. And honestly, even though this is interesting to me, I don't think that that's an experiment I'm going to do. But depending on what we think of the results here today, we could try starting dry versus starting pre-soaked. And so that is something that we could explore. But anyway, let's go pick some colors we're gonna dye. I have a bunch of different dye stocks that I could use. Let's start by playing with some Jacquard Jet Black and Jacquard Hot Fuchsia, because I know that this is a combination of colors that will break or separate. The Jet Black will probably strike a lot faster to the yarn than the Hot Fuchsia. And so this could give us a little bit of information maybe about how the dyes are traveling through the knot, depending on if and how much of a pink halo we see around our more black area. These jars hold 250 milliliters, and I don't want the color to be too dark on our yarn. Which, okay, we have under, and I'll rinse out this bottle into our dye bath. We have under 100 milliliters of the Jet Black. I would say that maybe we have approximately 75 milliliters. Now we could measure this, but there's also no reason to. Okay, and so because of that, let's take about, okay, and as for our Hot Fuchsia, let's see, 25. Yeah, let's go ahead and do 30 milliliters. And we can also rinse out this container into our dye bath. So this gives us a total, and maybe we had a little more than 75, but we have a little over. I'm remeasuring so that way I can see the markers. Maybe there was more black dye than I thought, but maybe we have around 112 or so milliliters of dye total. This total volume is not that important, except to know that we have a little over 1 gram of dye to dye 300 grams of yarn in this first stage. In this pot, we have 24 cups of water. And so where do I want to start with the acid? Let's start with 3. I'm probably gonna go up, but if we started with no acid, then the dyes would travel into that knot a little bit further than they would if we start off with like high acid. So you know what? Let's stick with the 3. We'll see what happens. I know that with Stroll and just my tap water being slightly acidic, some of the color is gonna strike right away, no matter what, but we'll see how all of this goes. Now, I just started heating things up. And so I can put my plastic containers. You can see our color, oh, maybe you can't see. Color's a little bit purplish with the pink and the black. And now I'm coming over with these dye stock bottles, and I'm adding in the last little bit of color that I can. Because why not take advantage of that? And now we'll wait for things to heat up. We are not at a boil, but things are getting warm. I suppose that the temperature of my dye bath is another one of those variables that I could control for more, but I usually don't bother. Now, I think the little bubbles, it looked like one of the inside of the squeeze bobbles was a little bit soapy. There were some suds when I rinsed it, so that could be what's on the surface. But now, let's take our knotted yarn and add it in. And I'm not trying to like dip dye things per se, but we could get some fun color breaking on the outside. You can see how some areas are more pink and more black. I'm not squeezing anything, but I am pushing it under the surface. And well, now we just have to wait. And that's always the hardest part, because I know that this type of color combination produces really fun, really beautiful results. And in fact, oh my goodness, even right here, I don't know if that's on one of the knot areas, I see tons of pink. I don't know if any of these knots are gonna loosen up in here. So we've got color breaking and lots of fun things. So who knows if we're gonna dye another layer of color on top of these or not. But I'm glad I decided to go with a mixture that would break, and I'm excited to see where we go. Because my schedule allows it, I'm gonna wait 30 minutes. Otherwise, I might wait less time, but just a couple minutes after adding it, a lot of that black dye is on the yarn and we just have pinks left. The other reason why I'm gonna go ahead and wait for 30 minutes is, what if I decide this is the only layer of dyeing we're going to do? And so then we'll just have to see what happens. But I'm gonna try my best to not touch anything over the next 30 minutes. It's been 30 minutes and I'm gonna turn off the heat. If you were doing this with non-superwash yarn, I would not want there to be bubbles. And let's check. There is still a little bit of pink in the water, not very much. This is normal for a fluorescent pink like hot fuchsia. We see some glorious breaking. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, I am going to leave everything in here for a little bit. Just let it cool off and let things get a little less steamy before we attempt to remove the yarn. And I'll give myself more space. I'll probably bring it to the counter so that way we can have a bigger view in case things unknot as I'm removing them from the dye bath. So I'll see you in a little bit. But actually, one thing I can do now is I can add more acid because I never did that. I'm gonna add 1, 2, 3 more tablespoons of white vinegar. Clearly, most of the color is set with just the one, but it never hurts to have a little more acid. It's really hard to see what's going on in the pot. And so let's remove the yarn. I'm gonna lift it by a zip tie and look at that. Oh, this is so cool. So when I lifted it, it shifted where the knot was to reveal some of that resist. Oh, that is really, really cool. Oh man, this one too. But look at that halo that we have of the pink. And this is why we may not be dyeing this in multiple rounds. And I'm gonna have to revisit this project at some point. Oh, this is so exciting. But this also means that if, when I was dyeing this, if I did a lot of raising and lowering, the knot could tighten as I'm doing that, and that could alter the results. Oh, there's so many possibilities and variables I can't control for here. I am so excited. Now, obviously, we do have some color left in the dye bath. That's not that much pigment, and we do have what looks like some crocking, or I guess solid dye particles that are around the edge of the pan. That can happen. That doesn't mean that the yarn is gonna crock on hands when you go and work with it or anything. But what I do like to do, if we're gonna be dyeing more yarn in this pot, would be to take a damp paper towel and just wipe that dye off before dyeing another round. And this is because if you have that dye around that surface area. And you know, in some areas it's lighter and less visible than that first initial dark area. If we were adding white yarn to this pot, we could stain it, and not just stain, but actually dye it with that last little bit of color. So that's just something to watch out for. I quickly squeezed out some of the leftover water in the yarn back into the dye bath, so that way it would be a little easier to handle when we go to untie these knots. And then I took the yarn and laid it out on the counter so I could get a pretty shot before we proceed with the untying. This yarn looks so cool. There is no way I'm doing another layer on this right now. Just no way. I mean, we can see already the pink, the areas where the pink could bind but the black couldn't. And just because it tightened as I removed it. Now, to be fair, we have breaking up here as well. The black struck mostly, I guess, on the bottom area that went into the pot first than they did on the top. And that can happen. If you're moving the yarn around a lot in the dye bath, then you could be shifting where the resist is more than when we do other techniques, like a twisted skein. Although with twisted skeins, sometimes they untwist themselves. So that is always worth thinking about. I may not need to be wearing gloves for this, but let's go ahead and shift 2 of them down. Let's open up this one very carefully. Ooh. Oh man, you can see that where we had that resist. Oh, this is interesting. The pattern. Okay. Oh, it's so cool to see and just think about how your yarn is, like how things are on the inside versus the outside. Because in each section we have some of that white, but then I think both probably have some overlap areas. So sometimes it'll go white, black, white, and other times you might not get as much of that separation of the color. This is a really cool effect, and I'm loving the way the colors broke. And again, the reason why we're seeing the black and all this pink is that the black dye strikes through the yarn a lot faster than the pink dye. And so that is what's giving us this really, really cool effect. Now, what if we did this with a primary color? Say we did this with yellow or something like that. I think that we could have really, really cool effects with that as well. You probably wouldn't, I mean, we wouldn't get breaking like this, but what we could end up with is some differences in the amount of saturation of the colors. So we'd be more likely to get different tones of, say, the blue or yellow, and I think that that would be really, really cool. Okay, but now, just for curiosity, let's try 2 different things. First, I'm gonna retie the skein just like this. It's actually a lot easier to do the knot while wet, and it probably pulls a little bit tighter. Okay, so now even just tying it, retying the same section, we have areas that are more black on the outside, but also some areas that are more pink, because within the yarn, the area of this that's on the outside probably varies. Now what would happen if I were to shift our zip tie down 90 degrees, and then this time we were to tie it? It's actually way easier to do this while wet. Okay, this time our knot is mostly black. There might be a little bit of pink that's in there, but more of the areas that are white are left out. So if we had done this in, say, blue and are gonna over dye it in yellow, we would have some area that would remain blue, some areas that would show up as yellow, and then a lot that would be green. And that is pretty cool. So there are definitely options here, and it's gonna give things that are very random. I think it's gonna be hard to predict how it's going to come out, But clearly I need to do this again with layering colors, which was the original plan today, but that's not what we're going to do. So I'm gonna untie these again. I mean, we could definitely over dye this, but I think that this effect is so cool that I can't bring myself to over dye it. If you want me to over dye it, please let me know in the comments, and I can start with a very similar black pink solution, dye this up again, and then over dye it. But now I'm gonna wait for this to finish cooling so that way I can wash it. But that is very pretty. It is worth noting that if we were doing this with blue and yellow, we wouldn't have like dark blue where the black is and light blue where the pink is. Instead, we'd probably get a color that's a lot more like the black, and where we see darker black and lighter gray, that's some of the more tone difference we might see with the blue, or maybe not. But the pattern that we get of those white patches is really unique and very different from when we twist the skein to dye it. It's really interesting to me how tying the yarn in a knot sort of spreads out part of the skein onto the outside, whereas twisting the yarn like puts a lot of the yarn in the interior, and so the patterns of this resist are very different. I do have a video where I dyed twisted skeins of yarn in a black fluorescent pink combination very similar to this, and I'll try to remember to link that down below. But I'm very intrigued, and definitely there's less control over what yarn is in the middle than even with twisted skeins, and certainly less control than if I use zip ties as the resist. But it's still really fun to get a reveal. Now clearly we have one follow-up we already need to do. There's another obvious follow-up. I need to tie knots in a sock blank, right? We need to do that. I did do a more traditional tie-dye effect on a sock blank once a long time ago, and a lot of times the way that that yarn is scrunched in the pan, you do get tie-dye like effects, but yeah, the knots would be fun. I suppose the one thing that makes tie-dyeing with a superwash wool sock blank different from tie-dyeing a t-shirt is that fiber reactive dyes on cotton are going to spread way more because they strike slower than acid dyes do on wool. And so you're not going to get as much of the spread and breaking unless you're using colors like we have here that we know will break. So we've got some ideas, and I know Editing Rebecca is taking notes, but now let's go wash our yarn. Let's wash our yarn. I'm going to add a little bit of some dish soap into here. Oh man, and I know it's a time of day where we got some sunshine on there, which is going to make it harder to see, but that's why we'll look at the finished dry yarn in the end. I'll probably end up calling this more like white, charcoal gray, and pink because the black isn't that intense. But that means that the pink is popping so much. Now, with these two colors and how quickly the jet black struck, we would see tonal variation without the resist. Like we see breaking in these ends that we added in dry. And so that little delay that some of the yarn went into the water really is helping things. But this is so fun. Okay, I'm gonna go put this through my spin dryer. We don't have any color bleeding, and hang it up to dry so we can take a closer look of how it looks in the end. And maybe I'll even bring out a black light, if I remember. We'll see. The zip ties are still on our 3 skeins, but they're not in that original location because we know that, I guess all of them were set up a little bit more like this, where we had our knot in the center and the ends that were free. The amount of breaking we have in the exposed areas is awesome. It is absolutely beautiful and fun. And I know I didn't see the original vision through, but this yarn is so cool. How could I dye it again? But if I were gonna dye it again, what color would you have done? I know I'm not sharing a knit swatch of what this yarn would look like knit up here, But I can tell you that it could pool depending on the type of project you're working on and the number of stitches, but the pooling patterns would change over time because the sections of color are not completely even throughout the skeins. And I'm bringing this up again because I get a lot of questions about dyeing planned pooling yarn. And the thing with yarn that is used to create really cool argyle, plaid type colorways, those are usually machine dyed. They're not hand dyed. And so they don't have the level of imperfection that hand dyed skeins have that make them unique and wonderful and beautiful. So I love creating things like this that are more random. I guess that's my conclusion. But anyway, this is also an example where knowing your dyes and how they behave can help you create something magical. Because I knew that mixing a fluorescent pink with a black dye will result in breaking. The blacks will strike first, the pinks are going to spread more. And there are other color combinations that you can create that you know might break. Anything I use for glazing mixed for things that I say would not be good for glazing may not have something quite this dramatic, but still could work and give you some really fun effects. Lainey Mueller and Christopher Mikesell, thank you so much for being my lab partners for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you have enjoyed this dyeing project and that you're gonna like the yarn. Now, if you want a shout out in a ChemKnits video, there are many different ways to do that. You can become a lab partner or last minute lab partner through my listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, or you can become a silk level patron over on Patreon, and every month the silk level patrons get a verbal shout out and a shout out on the screen, and then the alpaca patrons get like a text shout out. There's lots of perks over on Patreon besides the shout outs, but if you're curious, those are the different ways that I incorporate those into my edited videos. But anyway, Lainey and Christopher, thank you again for being my lab partners. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I hope that you enjoy my very talky thought process as I'm putting color on yarn and playing around with different techniques. And today I'm so excited that we did this project. I think that these kinds of knots are going to be trickier to work with, to do reproducibly, but there's so much potential, and I'm so excited to see how far we can take it. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. And if you love the yarn that I dye, go and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. It's filled with hand-dyed yarn featured in my videos. And in every listing, I try to include the video title and approximate date that it was published, so that way you can go and find the video to see exactly how I dyed up that yarn. But anyway, now I need to go and plan out what I'm going to be dyeing up this week. Thank you so much for watching.